Good afternoon, everyone. I think let's get started. My name is Alex Zhang. I'm the Associate Dean of Information Services and Research Professor of Law at Duke Law School. And today, on behalf of the entire Goodson Law Library team, I would like to welcome you all to our Fall 2022 Duke Law Author Book Talk series. And before the programming, I would like to thank and especially our Associate Dean of Intellectual Life and Professor of Law and Political Science, Professor Neil Siegel, for co-sponsoring this event and for providing lunch. I would also like to thank all the colleagues who have worked behind the scenes to make this event possible, and they are our colleagues in the Media Services Office, Events Office, Academic Technology Team, our Law Library's Associate Director, Jennifer Behrens, and our Administrative Assistant, Shauna Banguro. And today we're here to celebrating Professor Jed Berdy's new book, Two Cheers for Politics: Why Democracy is Flawed, Frightening, and Our Best Hope. And as part of the library's ongoing effort to collect the best works on Earth, I'm sure that we have a copy waiting for you to check out at the library. But if you feel so strongly to own your own copy after today's session, you can purchase on Amazon or in local bookstores. What makes today's event even more special is that we have the pleasure of inviting and having Professor Lisa Griffin to join us as a moderator to this discussion. Professor Griffin is our Candace M. Dara and Ladon B. Simon Professor of Law and Senior Associate Dean for Research and Faculty at Duke Law School. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Lisa Griffin and our faculty book author of the day, Professor Jed Berdy.
Thank you, Alex, and everyone who made this possible. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Jed, for coming to campus to discuss your new book. It's a privilege to talk about your learned and eloquent and inspiring book, and we will get to that in a moment. But first, it's also a pleasure to welcome you back to Duke. So this is a celebration of your book and also a little bit of a homecoming for you. And I was hoping that we could just start by asking you to reflect for a moment on what brought you back to Duke.
Of course. So my family and I were away for 3 years after having been at Duke for 15. We were up in New York City at Columbia. And of course, a decision involving a whole family has many dimensions, and not all of them for this event. But fundamentally, it was a decision, I think, about the importance of community and place and personal history in our lives. Duke has a wonderful, wonderful faculty, a wonderful student body. I loved teaching here, and I loved having the friends and colleagues that I've returned to. These are all great places to work. But in a deeper sense, we developed a feeling as our family grew about where we belonged, where we had a sense of connection that really went beyond the workplace and beyond our professional identities, and was personal and civic and geographic. That's maybe a little abstracted. I'm trying to compress a lot of late night conversations and a lot of deliberation into a few phrases. So this is a wonderful place to be. In some sense, no one should have to ask the question, why would you decide to be here rather than somewhere else? But fundamentally, I think for us, the question was, where do we belong? Where do we have the strongest sense of community?
I also want to take just a moment to situate this particular book in your body of work. For some of the students in the room who may not know you as well, if I'm right, this is your 8th book.
It's something like that.
Something like that. Well, in any event, it's remarkable, and sufficiently remarkable that we don't have time to list all of the books. But it is a book that fits into the arc of 20 scholarly years of conversation. And your books, very broadly, are about how to live together in a mutual environment, both literally and figuratively, how to share property and power in an increasingly complex world. And I'm interested in why this book and why now. because it seems both to respond to a very extraordinary moment in American political life and also to fit within something you've been talking about for a long time.
I appreciate that, Lisa. Thanks. And I also just want to say, which I didn't before, that I feel really privileged to be having this conversation with you in particular. Professor Griffin is one of the great readers and the great payers of attention on the faculty, a wonderful person to have look at what you've said and to think with you about what you've thought. So I asked specifically for her to do this event together. And I do also want to amplify the thanks to the library staff and the rest of the law school staff who've helped to make this event happen. So yeah, there have been a lot of books about democracy in the last 5 or 6 years for obvious reasons. Because democratic systems have reminded us that they can do things we weren't expecting, and in many cases, things we're not happy about. For many people, that began with the Brexit election. For many people, it began in November of 2016. People have different starting points, but I'd say in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a great unsettling of expectations about what a system like ours does, how it might threaten us as much as protect us. And of course, I had been thinking about those things like everybody else. I'd also been involved in a few different projects that came before this time, which kind of drove me to want to think in a more serious and sustained way about the idea of democracy. I wrote a book about 8 years ago about environmental law and environmental politics and the long history of the ways that the law has advanced different conceptions of what the natural world is and how we fit into it, why it matters and how we can get right with it. And at the end, looking toward the future, I called for what I termed a democratic relationship to our environmental situation. And I've also been involved with a kind of scholarly movement, for lack of a better word, called the Law and Political Economy Project. And I'd say if you were to put a phrase on the motives of this body of scholars, it is that we're people interested in a greater degree of democratic accountability for our economic lives. Not necessarily meaning that we vote on everything in the economy, but that we think about the way our economic order and the way that it distributes power and capacity and vulnerability fits into the idea of ourselves as citizens of equal members of a democratic society, and whether the economic order supports or undercuts a democratic ideal of ourselves. So I found myself again and again running into the thought that I was in settings where people were using the term democracy a lot, and I was using it a lot, and there was not actually a lot of careful thought about what we meant. It tended to come down to whatever seemed most important to us or most sort of threatened in our eyes just at that moment. And so in some ways, that sort of longer arc and the more immediate political situation, I think, came together in wanting to write a book about why democracy is hard, why people have, I think, it's hard to speak for other people, but why a lot of people, I think, would say that on the one hand, they feel democracy is more at threat, more under threat, more in danger than ever before. On the other hand, they're not sure that it ever worked, don't entirely trust it anyway, wonder whether we were confused about it all along. And the book tries to take those misgivings really seriously and also to take fundamentally seriously, put first the idea that democracy really is the best we can do in politics and that we need to do it better and not run away from it.
So I want to get to some of the very ambitious arguments in the book, but I think we need to do a little bit more definitional work, starting where you just left off, on what you mean by some of these things. As you say, it's very, very common right now to hear that our democracy is in peril. And your point is we haven't ever really had a democracy. And that's the core of your book. And so I wanna get closer to that. There is a beautifully explanatory sentence early in the book, and I promise this will be the only time that I read to you. But I want to do that and then ask you what you mean by some of these terms. The pathologies of contemporary politics, angry partisan clannishness, overheated elections combined with weary doubt that government can do anything, are not evidence that democracy is failing, but symptoms of our failure to be democratic. And so I want to talk a little bit about what you mean by politics and anti-politics, and what you mean by democracy. And it's a big question, and it's a rich history of ideas in the book. We're going to focus on constitutional law in most of this conversation. So I'm not asking you to do what you do in the book, which is start in Athens and proceed through Hobbes and Madison and all the way up to Walt Whitman. But to really practically speaking, when you talk about politics and how it can be constructive, and democracy and what we should be aiming for, what do you mean by those terms?
That's perfect. Thank you. So the book's title is about politics and not about democracy, because in a sense, to believe in democracy, you have to have a clear idea of politics, of what the domain is, the area of questions that democracy addresses. And I'd put it this way. There's a set of decisions that we can't avoid making because they set the terms on which we live together. And as long as we are stuck living together, which people always, everywhere are, we can either make these decisions explicitly or we can pretend we're not making them, which is a way of making them without acknowledging it. What are these decisions? Among other things, they're the decisions that the curriculum of the first year here gives you some of our working answers to. They are the principles of property law that tell you who has what, who can do what, who doesn't have, how did that happen? We can't avoid organizing the world in roughly the way that property law does to answer the question that sort of unavoidably arises when people are in the same space, which is, what can I do with that? Can I have that? And so forth. We have the same sort of questions in constitutional law or in criminal law. How is your body protected? How is your body vulnerable? What happens if someone crosses the threshold that's supposed to be protected? All of these questions are fundamentally specifications of how we're going to live together. And as I said before, we have to answer them one way or another. So when I talk about politics, I'm talking about the way that we give answers to those questions. Because there are a lot of possible answers. Not an infinite list, but a lot. Some have been tried with more success, some with less. There's still a significant range on the table about who has what you're entitled to just for showing up in this world, what counts as a violation of your body, how you get protected, how you don't get protected. We know the Supreme Court made decisions on this last term. Police make decisions about this every day, for worse and better, and so on, and just to try to nail down what I'm talking about. It's at 10,000 feet, but it's also about what all the institutions of the law are always doing. So what's the point of saying that's politics? Well, being for democracy as a political concept doesn't mean you want voting on everything. It doesn't mean you want voting on what's the greatest novel of the 20th century. At least you don't want a vote that's going to bind everyone based on how the vote comes out. But in the domain of questions I'm talking about, we all have to live with the answer. You don't actually get to pick your own answer. None of us do. And it's for that reason that the answer, by its nature, binds all of us. That I think the best way of deciding these questions is the democratic way. What does that mean? Let me give you a 10,000 foot and then a much more concrete version of the same idea. 10,000 foot is the idea that the people who have to live with a set of rules and principles and institutions should also be the ones who decide what those are. Not because they'll make perfectly wise or good decisions, but because there's no smaller set of the people who have to live with it that you should trust more. And the second point, which is sort of already embedded in the caveat I just gave, is that because there's never consensus, there's never complete agreement about the answers to these kinds of questions. If there were, we wouldn't have to pose the question. The best approximation of the people who live with the rules choosing the rules is a majority vote of those who have to live with the rules. As I said before, because except in extraordinary circumstances, and it will be good to talk maybe about what some of those are, like legal specialization, there's no subset that, I'll repeat what I said and then we can take off, figure out what we mean by that, that we should trust more to do it.
Can we talk a little bit more about how you translate the idea of people voting for things to what you're really wanting, which is a stronger voice for a majority in policymaking and decision-making? And you do talk about voting per se in the book, and you would appreciate a system that more closely approximated universal voting. And of course, you're in favor of expanding voting and, anti-gerrymandering and also favor counting votes, which is another good thing. But it's very clear from your book that voting is necessary but not sufficient for what you're talking about. It's not just voting and it's not just activism, but it's engaged majority policymaking. And I'm hoping you can say a little bit more operationally how that would happen.
Well, there are a lot of different ways. So here's an important, maybe a way of developing that thought. So a vote can really only say yes or no to a question presented to it. So if you're in favor of voting and majority rule, you have to take a lot of interest in the question of how the issues get posed and who poses them. And I spend some time in the book talking about what is in some ways the most fundamental, but and also the most difficult face of this issue in American politics, which is constitutional revision, constitutional reform, and try to think about what it would mean to open up the constitutional system to a greater democratic flexibility and democratic accountability. I don't actually spend a lot of time in the book trying to say what I think would be the best system of representation, policymaking, committee structure, in part because I think there are a lot of plausible answers to that question. There are a lot of plausible ways of composing a congressional majority out of lots of dispersed votes. There are a lot of plausible ways and attractive ways of localizing some decisions, like community budgeting has been experimented with here in Durham. A lot of these, done in the right way, in the right circumstances, can be in a broad way democratizing. And when I say democratizing, I mean fundamentally they give people both the idea and the reality of shaping their own shared circumstances and make it more acceptable to us, get us in the habit of thinking that the people we have to live with are going to be the people whose decisions we're going to have to live with as well. Because for us to be the authors of our own social world means that everyone who's in it is the author of our own social world together.
So let's start there with authoring our social world. We're going to work our way through the subtitle, Flawed, Frightening, and Our Best Hope. I'm a Californian. and you and I talked about this the other day, and we in our state have some experience of direct democracy. And you're very careful that you accept the inevitable representative nature of democracy, and you're not arguing for direct democracy, but you're arguing for something that approximates it a little more. And this gets us into that trust issue that you're talking about, and willingness to accept the decisions of others with which you may disagree, not just because of your preferences, but because of some underlying empirical wrongness to their ideas. So, for example, in California, we have ballot propositions. The way that they are funded and then framed in the voting process is incredibly problematic. But we also, through direct democracy, have banned affirmative action, stripped immigrants of social services, entrenched property rights, prohibited marriage equality. Unless you count legalizing marijuana, it's an undercurrent of cruelty to pretty much everything that's happened in the ballot propositions. And I know you've thought about this and been asked this before. What is the response to this worry about bad policy being made when there is some majority voice to be heard?
Yes. So it's such an important and such a salient American counterexample. I will first say, I'll sort of amplify what you noted, that the way who poses the question is incredibly important, and the way of putting questions on the California ballot is not a good way of doing it. And when I talk about constitutional revision, I spend some time talking about a way that I think a process of proposing constitutional change could be deliberative and representative and distinct from everyday politics, rather than subject to the kinds of essentially signature buying and kind of rich special interest manipulation that the California process is. We've learned a lot about how direct democracy does and doesn't work thanks to California's negative experience. But I'd also say fundamentally that any system of political decisions can hurt us, can hurt people, and can and will produce bad results. And all the things that have been done through initiative in California have been done through legislative and other more austere and august institutions in other states. And if we do more sort of moral scorekeeping on which of our greatest kind of social transformations we owe to unrepresentative institutions like the courts or less representative, and which we owe to more representative institutions, I think we see that it's actually on the basis of majority movements and majority votes, like the votes that produced the Civil Rights Act, 64 to 68, 72, that are much more of an anchor of our sort of shared expectations of basic freedom and equality. The New Deal is another imperfect but important example. So if we thought that majorities, I'll put it this way, if we thought the majorities were specially and incorrigibly cruel and selfish, and that we could point to another kind of institution that would consistently produce better results, and those results could somehow be socially stable and accepted, that would be good. I think one of the kind of premises of some parts of American legal culture in the second part of the 20th century and early in the 21st century was that we had found an institution like that, and it was the courts interpreting the Constitution, and I don't think that turns out to be right. There was a special historical moment in which a lot of us, especially those of us who tend to be heavily represented at elite law schools, could think that way. But I think there's a lot of appropriate pressure on that question now. Late last week, Jamelle Bouie had a very good column in the Times on essentially the moral performance of national majorities, in which he said more elaborately, with more detail, and like 800, 1,000 words, what I just said about majorities actually doing pretty well, and especially actually doing pretty well at the national scale.
You persuaded me of something when I read your book, because my first reaction to the thesis was your notion of everyone having sort of equal voice and taking turns and accepting that they're in power one day and someone else is in power the next day. You start to think, okay, so for a while the flat earthers run NASA when I'd rather have the astrophysicists be in charge, and you're not, and it doesn't seem like a very comfortable outcome, and you worry about what is often called the tyranny of the majority, which is the disfavored groups and vulnerable individuals who are going to suffer mightily under what we fear and envision. What you persuaded me of is that we've actually been living for a long time with the tyranny of the minority, and so that we might as well try something else. And I think that that's what you're getting at in what you just said. And I think it gets us to some of your theories, and I accept that you're trying to start a conversation and not operationalize everything, about the Constitution in particular. There is an enormous amount of trust that you are willing to place in your fellow democracy dwellers throughout the book. And it is a leap of faith to come along with you on that trusting premise. Should one do that, the next step, in your view, is a sort of every generation constitutional revision. Can you say first why you think the Constitution itself is getting in our way? What's counter-majoritarian about it? And then we'll talk about changing it.
Great. So a lot of people have become vividly aware that the Constitution has a number of structural features that are counter-majoritarian and, in my terms, counter-democratic. The Electoral College has given the presidency to the loser of the national popular vote twice in this century, the last 22 years, and almost did it a third time. That would have been a different kind of constitutional crisis. Under 100,000 votes switching, fewer, under 50, depending how you're counting, would have given Donald Trump an Electoral College majority with a 7 million vote national popular vote loss. And what would we have done? That's the Constitution in its Electoral College dimension working for us. The unrepresentative character of the Senate is also notorious. Now everyone kind of understands this. I think it was less vivid a decade ago even, certainly when I was coming up. I should say very quickly, a lot of this book is written against a backdrop that I think many of my colleagues will share. I would be interested at what point it ceases becoming the backdrop, because I'm not sure students will have this view still, though some might remember it from elementary school or high school. There was an idea for a long time that we didn't have to think very hard about what democracy was for a couple of reasons. One was that whatever it was, it seemed like we had figured it out. And our set of institutions seemed to be approximating it pretty well. The other thought was that we might not have to think about it very hard because it was probably where the whole world was tending, from the magnificent, peaceful, anti-totalitarian revolutions of 1989, which I remember, but students will not remember, through the optimistic moment of the Arab Spring in 2013, I want to say, and through the great optimism about the incorporation of China into the World Trade Organization in the first decade of this century. There was the thought that everything ran in one direction and everything tended to become us. And what we were was pretty stable and was working pretty well. It's the cracking of all of that expectation that's part of the backdrop that the book is written against. And that's, among other things, forced our attention to the ways that our system is actually counter-democratic. Being counter-democratic is particularly a problem if the constitutional features we're talking about, like the Electoral College and the Senate, provide the conditions of possibility for an anti-democratic non-majority majority. That is, for the minority rule strategy of national political control, where you can take control of the Senate, and you can take control of the White House, and you can take control of the Supreme Court without actually winning national majorities. And the fact that that was the strategy that worked for Trump and for Trumpist politics in the last 5-6 years makes really vivid what kind of problem we have, not least because it rewards a politics that doesn't actually try to build national majorities, but rather to frighten and mobilize selected minority votes. So these are the big ones. Then there's the Supreme Court itself. Should we talk about the Constitution and the Supreme Court right now, or shall I hand it back to you?
Actually, I mean, the book, I should say, ranges widely over issues, the economic issues associated with your vision of democracy and global capitalism and markets, and some other issues that have been through lines in much of your work. But we did decide to focus on the constitutional law piece of this, because the election approaches, the new court term has just started, and your harshest critique probably is reserved in the book, not even for the markets so much as for the Supreme Court. And it is interesting for a constitutional scholar to so thoroughly critique the system that we have, and your idea that issues that need to be put to majority vote are being decided by 9 people is something that I think is very much at the heart of what you're talking about in the book. And so let's talk about the court.
Let's talk about that. And maybe I'll just say, I guess it's true that the critique of the Supreme Court in the book is harsh. I try not to write a book that's harsh in tone. But I thought, in a way, my people who read the book, who are mostly in the NPR, New York Times, Washington Post kind of reading world, will know what they think about markets, and they certainly know what they think about Trumpist ethno-nationalism. And I don't need to spend a lot of time banging on those, not because they're not important, but because you don't need to say everything. But people in that world are shaken and reconsidering what the court and the Constitution are in our political system. And I do spend more time on those, and maybe I'm more severe in a way, because I want to suggest one way that reflection can go. So here's a way to think about it. If we ask ourselves, what's the authority of constitutional principle? Why is the Constitution the last word? We might start by taking seriously its first words, we the people. It presents itself as an act of fundamental lawmaking, that is, an act of constitution making, that is performed by the people who will live under its principles and do it with the purpose of enabling themselves to live better under its principles. I think that's the best foundation for a constitution. Commitment by the members of the community who will live under its rules and principles to those being the ones that will guide and constrain them. So unlike some critics of the constitutional order, like our colleague Sam Moyn at Yale and Ryan Dorfler at Harvard, I'm all for the constitutional entrenchment of fundamental decisions about rights and equality and limits on institutions. But I think that the further those decisions get away in time from the people who live under them, the more uncertain and manipulatable their meaning becomes, the more the content of those constitutional principles becomes unavoidably a question of interpretation rather than a question of decision. And I think one of the most powerful things about the idea of a constitution is actually the idea that it is the most democratic decision in the system, and that it is authorized in its principles by the people who will live under it. We, the living people, I think should perhaps be how the Constitution could be read to begin. So as Lisa was adumbrating, I suggest a sort of thought experiment, which is what if every 27 or 30 years, basically every generation, you knew that there were going to be a convention or series of conventions, maybe regional, then national, structured in a variety of ways to be genuinely and deeply representative and deliberative, from which some proposals might emerge to change the Constitution. They might not. The answer might be everything's fine here. I certainly think there's no reason at all to go back to scratch every 30 years. But some proposals might emerge to change the Electoral College, to change the representational structure of the Senate, to reverse Dobbs, perhaps. None of these would be surprising. To reverse Citizens United and the underlying line of decisions back to 1976 that anchor it also wouldn't be surprising. And then those proposed revisions, I should say not all of which liberals would like, no doubt, but there are actually some kind of low-hanging ones that I think liberals could perhaps expect. Those amendments would go to a national referendum. That national referendum would be, under the current system, the only direct act of a national majority in our constitutional system. National majorities do nothing else, since they don't elect the president and we don't otherwise vote nationally. And the Constitution that we then lived under for the next 30 years would be, I think in a real sense, the one that we had decided to live under. It would give marching orders to judges, but those marching orders would be in some ways significantly more constraining, I think, because the interpretation that followed would be in light of decisions in living memory. The originals, as it were, of originalism would be us. And I think that would be a better, I think it could be a better world, one in which we had more sense of responsibility for the system we live under and also more power over the system we live under. And if we don't think it would be a better world, I think we should think about what we mean by democracy and try to think very hard about why we wouldn't want that, because I do think that is what a democratic relation to a constitution would be.
I think we should talk a little bit more about how this would work. And I should have said that your critique of the court was encompassing. Your tone is never harsh.
I didn't mean...
Not in the book and not anywhere else.
I'm off Twitter now.
But it isn't encompassing. You're discomfited by originalism as you are by living constitutionalism. It's the act of telling the people what the Constitution means that concerns you, and the idea that it's an interpretive work instead of a constitutive work.
Yes, that's right.
And your idea is that history is what we make it, and constitutions make things, they constitute things, that's what they do, that's in the word. And we have the right and opportunity to do something differently about that. The first problem with that, of course, is that the Constitution itself is quite strict about how it is to be reconsidered or amended. And there's a moment where you suggest that one of the first things we need to do is change that. Sort of like you get 3 wishes and your first wish is for more wishes. How does this, and I understand that this is a book of ideas and theory and a conversation starter, but how do we get past the point where this tyranny of the minority is worse than ever in this particular context? Because Oklahoma and a few other states can stop us from doing anything to the Constitution.
Great. So totally, the Constitution is very hard to amend. Article 5, the amendment article, sets up a series of high hurdles, and the hurdles are structured in a federalist fashion so that amendments, when approved, have to be approved state by state. And it doesn't take that many small or large states. It doesn't take that many states. It doesn't take that much of the population to block any amendment. And as Lisa says, I suggest, well, you start by amending Article 5. By the way, the representation in the Senate provision says you can't amend it. I think it's clearly part of a democratic constitutional prerogative to amend that and then go forward. But that's an argument. That's a fight. So how do you get beyond it? I'm glad, this is going to sound like the first thing I'm going to say is going to sound like a punt, but then I'll say a couple of things that are not punts. But then this is genuine. I'm glad to have started a conversation in the sense that along with an organization called Protect Democracy and with some of my former colleagues at Columbia, I'm hosting this spring the first of a series of convenings with scholars and also some leading journalists and commentators. Jamel Bowie just said he would join us on the question of whether formal routes to constitutional change are open or should be open and what that would look like from the point of view of trying to protect or strengthen democracy at the national level, at the state level. There will be historians there. Some of your favorite constitutional scholars will be there. So I don't, in a sense, I don't know, but I'm glad that people think it's a question again. But here are a couple of things that we do know. One is that at least part of the reason it's so hard to amend things, including things like Article 5, is that our political culture, our reform culture, and our mobilizations and our elite political consciousness have all been totally turned away from the idea of explicit change of the national constitution for decades. And what you don't think about, you definitely won't do. So they've changed the Constitution in quite basic ways before using Article 5. The Senate, my colleagues will know, many of you will know, used to be entirely appointed by state legislatures. The 17th Amendment, I think, I should never give a specific number, but I'm 90% sure. But anyway, there it is. That's my tell. It is, thank you. Was passed through 3/4 of state legislatures. That is, they got the very people who were giving up the power to appoint the senators, which was a powerful patronage kind of role, among other things, to give it up. How? Partly by defeating a bunch of people who had opposed the effort to pass the amendment a cycle earlier. So you actually can mobilize people with electoral effect around constitutional change of a structural kind. It's not out of the question, even with Article 5. History gives us some existence proof. I don't want to sound reckless here, but I'll just observe that some of the most significant changes in the structure of the Constitution have not fully complied with the pre-existing constitutional provisions. The Reconstruction Amendments are intensely debated in terms of the way that the consent of the former Confederate states was achieved. The Constitution itself, the original Constitution, famously departs from the approval principles of the Articles of Confederation, although I guess they did eventually get around to satisfying the unanimity requirement of the Articles. There's a real question, and I just mean to say there's a real question, which I hope to see people take up and reflect on, because it's the kind of thing that could only become real if you had a strong national majority view about it. It could never be the kind of thing that could be like hacked as an elite trick. That maybe it's an intrinsic power of a democratic majority living under a constitution to make basic revisions to the Constitution in an open, transparent, explicit, majoritarian way. Akhil Amar at Yale has argued something to this effect, looking back to the language of framers like James Wilson, who's a very learned and very important contributor to the Constitution, one of the less recognized, who said that the power to amend the Constitution is inherent in and can never be taken away from the people who will live under the Constitution. If you were even to begin thinking along those lines, the degree of political responsibility you would be taking on would be of the very highest, and it would not be something to talk about lightly. But it's at least a question we ought to raise. Are there ways that it could be in a way legitimate to amend the most anti-democratic features of the Constitution outside their own terms, which is to say outside the terms of Article 5? But I certainly wouldn't want anyone to hurry there. I would just want us to think the question might be a question.
So before we turn it over for other people's questions, one slightly personal one for you that I warned you about. External events can exert a sort of undertow sometimes, and the book feels like a buoy, and sometimes conversations with you feel the same. We were talking about your resistance to the temptation to despair, the admirable way in which you avoid some of the things that you describe and sympathize with in the book, like cynicism and some sort of learned pessimism. There's a unfailing optimism about the way that you express yourself, the things that you choose to write about, and what you imagine to be possible. And especially for the students, but I think for all of us, how do you do that?
So Lisa, that's a really generous characterization. I don't know that I would claim all of it for myself. But I would say the book is, if the book is optimistic, and there's a way that it is, or at least hopeful, the reasons might be interesting to someone who's not in my head, because I don't think the reasons are just about my mood. And if there's an optimism in the book, it's not because I particularly expect that things are going to go really, really well. I'd say rather it's rooted in political and intellectual judgment. And that judgment is the following, that to the extent that we live with institutions, live under institutions, and we do, the ones we're talking about, that give us the potential to revise our world, our lives for the better. We have a responsibility to emphasize, take seriously, put weight on, call out, and try to get as much as we can from the aspects of those institutions that work, that let us do that. I think there's a kind of, I would say, a practical optimism or a practical hopefulness that is actually what I think of as the heart of civic responsibility. If institutions that you have despaired of will not do anything good, institutions that you are demanding more from than you think they are capable of are the ones that might produce something surprising. So when I try to think about what a kind of troubled idea like patriotism could mean in this world, I think of it as meaning, on the one hand, that all the wrongs and the harms and the crimes, as well as the achievements of the country that you happen to be caught in or that you've chosen, are partly your responsibility. They're partly on you, regardless of whether you have any personal implication in them. And second, you have a responsibility to try to keep active and make real and make better the aspects of that system that can actually reform it to repair and remedy and move beyond some of those harms and make it more genuinely democratic, so that it could be a system that actually deserves a higher degree of loyalty than you might think, or a higher degree of attachment than you might think that it does now. So that's the kind of judgment that's behind a certain kind of constructiveness in the book. Maybe because it's easy for me temperamentally to despair, and I think I'm not alone in that these days. The book is interested in the reasons that we shouldn't. Yeah.
Questions?
Hi, Jed. So I'd like to ask you to perhaps reflect on two different areas of your scholarship and to resolve what people may think of as a tension between them. Right? So part of the argument of this book is, I take it, and I've not read it, but I'm looking forward to it, right, that decisions should be made by the groups of people most likely to be affected by them, most affected by them. That seems to be most challenging in circumstances involving the environment. Right? Situations in which the effects of our behaviors are often felt extranationally and almost exclusively are felt subsequently into the future. So how might we think about the application of democratic principles that you talk about here, the kinds of problems that we face in the context of the environment and climate change?
Thanks, Chris. That's a really good and important question, and I'll try to compress my answer since I want to, for obvious reasons. So, problems of a global scale, and there are more and more of those, are a genuine conundrum for national democracy, and all of the democracies that we know operate on national platforms, and largely on historical inherited national platforms. And no one is very excited about the constructive potential of adjusting borders right now. So I think we have to live with the fact that political institutions are fundamentally artificial and incorrigibly historical. We can only take democratic action, we can only take any political action within the institutions that we start from. So I think there's an impulse sometimes to say, well, we have to start taking environmental decisions at a global scale. I think that idea doesn't even make, like, you can't do it. You can't actually make that idea into anything real until you build up a series of institutional decision points that, in order to have power and authority, have to start with the polities we now have, which are on the national scale. So I think it's a genuine dilemma, but I think it's one that has to be addressed from within the political systems that we have, which are geographically bounded and historically bounded. I'd say something like the WTO, something like the liberal trade system of the last 30 years is testament to how much system building national, and especially the rich, powerful national countries can do when they think something is really important and when there are powerful interests behind it. So it's not out of the question that dilemma can be somewhat bridged.
Matt.
So I wonder whether you might be something about, maybe talk about the book, I haven't read yet, read it, about the law of morality divide. Is that something?
Yeah.
I'm happy to agree, or originally agree, that it would be a good thing as a legal matter to have our basic legal institutions more responsive to national majority, both level of legislation and the level of constitutional change itself. Although, let me say, the referendum is a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks that major policy questions should be put to national referendum. But we can argue about that. But that question, that is what the legal role, or institutional role of democracy should be, is distinct from the moral question, whether, any moral right I might think I have is ultimately trumped by majority decision. I mean, I think most people, anyone who believes in fundamental human rights denies that, right? So, for example, my most basic right is freedom of thought, right? If a national majority says, we're going to plant this thing in your brain to control your thoughts, I'm not going to concede that that's morally legitimate. I'm going to take every step to resist that, right? So, so I just wonder what your thoughts are about the law of morality divide. And if you're not claiming that democracy is a master moral principle, right? That there are some moral rights limits to democratic decision, how you now think that?
Absolutely. Matt, thank you. So it'll be a longer conversation between us. So to telegraph the answer, I don't think democracy decides morality. I think we would agree that that would be a category error. I'm very interested in the role of moral dissent and strong moral dissent to the point of civil disobedience within a democracy. That's not really in this book. Lisa said in our pre-conversation, every book contains unwritten multitudes. But I've just finished editing a collection of Henry Thoreau's writing, the author of Walden and also Civil Disobedience, with some real attention to trying to think about how conscientious dissent, even of a very strong kind of fits into democracy. So I think these questions are important and hard. There is a certain kind of skeptical Democrat, some would say a Hobbesian Democrat, who thinks that it's not a real question. I do think it's a real question. But I also think that for the easy examples where we imagine, and of course you're just using it rhetorically, the mind control device, but the ones where we all say, oh, well, clearly it would be a terrible thing, we wouldn't let a majority do that, they probably won't. And for the ones where a majority does something that a lot of us regard as terrible, there's probably a deep disagreement about either what the moral principle is or what the moral principle requires. And in that case, the operational political question, which is different, of course, from the moral question, is to the extent that we have to live with one answer, how is that answer going to get made? And that is where I fall back on the democratic answer. So there is a sense in which, so far as we have to have one solution to these questions for purposes of getting along together, I think the burden of proof should always be on the non-democratic answer, and the presumption should be in favor of a democratic answer.
I want to get in one question.
Hi.
I just want to say, Professor Curdy, that After Nature is a very foundational work for me to try to pursue environmental policy. So I just want to thank you for the work that you've done in that space.
I'm so glad. Thank you. I noticed that multicolored kite on the book cover. Sit on your, yeah, exactly. On my way down. The original image was of footprints on a beach being washed away. No one in the publishing industry had ever seen the great Christian poster, Footsteps in the Sand. Fortunately, my wife had seen it, and she said, you should tell them that that's taken. That's not about the Anthropocene.
I didn't buy the book for its cover, but it was great too. I do want to bring us back to some of the questions around democracy and the interests of the environment, because one of the areas in which I have seen maybe democratic institutions not produce outcomes that we might argue are better from environmental concerns are when you have kind of hyper-localized concerns. Like, for instance, growing up in Wyoming, everyone wanted to log and like exterminate wolves, right? So I don't think that was good for the world as a whole. But if Wyoming as a state had more democratic authority to do those things, I think things that are more of a national or international trust could be lost. So I'm wondering how you think about some of the tensions between how we define who gets power over things that have both local implications and kind of broader international and even intertemporal scope.
This is an absolutely great question. I mostly just want to acknowledge that it's important and difficult, and I want to maybe note there's an impulse sometimes, a sort of, I think, a simple-minded version of the principle that Chris invoked in a not simple-minded way, that the people who are affected by a decision should make it, which turns into the thought that more local input is sort of democratic per se, that that's kind of what it means. I think that's not what it means. Not necessarily, anyway. And this is a great case. Housing policy is a great case. There are many, many, many. I think the question of the scale on which decisions should be made is actually a perennial and really hard one for political systems. I think constitutionalizing it, this is not what you said, but it goes to the conversation. Constitutionalizing it through something like our federalism is often counterproductive. I do think the ultimate decision about where the scale of power lies should be at the highest level, which is typically in our systems for now, the national level. This is complicated, but fundamentally I think it's right. But I think a good political system will devolve a lot of responsibility, but in conditional ways, to more local processes. That more gives a sketch of a framework for your question, because I think, as you see, there's no simple way to answer it. These are really hard and important questions. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Jed.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.